17,412. That was the number of structural compromise reports filed in Sector Gamma. 7/7 during the rotation, I began operational service with the Excavation Corps. I memorized it because the drilling superintendent repeated it during the orientation briefing, not as a warning, but as evidence of efficient documentation. He considered the figure proof that the system functioned. I understood his meaning differently once I spent my first shift 3 kilometers below the original surface level. My name was Davrin Cole. I was 19 standard years old when the Administratum Conscription lottery selected my identification number for mandatory excavation labor assignment. Before that designation, I worked in the recaf processing plants on level 42, which the Hive City designated as a mid-tier residential and light industrial zone. The work involved standing at a filtration station for 12-hour shifts, monitoring the flow of stimulant compounds through corroded pipes that predated my grandfather's birth. The labor was tedious. The environment was breathable. I could still see the interior lights of the hive structure when I walked the 2 kilometers from my habitation block to the processing facility. I am providing this context because I need you to understand that I knew what normal life in the hive felt like before they sent me down. I had experienced ordinary misery, the manageable kind, the type that permits a human consciousness to continue functioning within tolerable parameters. What occurred in the deep excavation zones existed in a different category entirely. The selection notice arrived on a data slate delivered by a servitor whose locomotion servos clicked in a rhythm that still loops in my accessible memory 3 decades after I heard it. The message was brief. My identification number had been selected for immediate reassignment to the Excavation Corps, Deep Sector Expansion Division. I was required to report to Processing Station 91 within 6 hours. The notice listed no appeals process. It did not explain why my number had been selected. It simply stated the new assignment as established fact and specified the consequences of non-compliance. Summary execution for desertion of critical infrastructure duty. I read the notice 4 times before the information resolved into something I could process. My father stood behind me in our habitation unit, which measured 3 meters by 5 meters and housed both of us in the 2 years since my brother had died, during a ventilation system failure in the lower manufactorum districts. My father said nothing for approximately 40 seconds. Then he placed his hand on my shoulder. His palm was calloused from 37 years of labor in the same recap facility where I had worked, and spoke in a voice that carried no inflection. The Imperium requires your service in a capacity where your labor can be most efficiently utilized. This is the purpose for which you were born. I recognized the phrase. It came from the institutional conditioning texts they recited in the Schola youth preparation programs. He had been taught to say it. I had been taught to accept it. Neither of us believed the words carried any genuine meaning, but we both understood that articulating that doubt served no function. The system did not require our belief, only our compliance. I reported to Processing Station 91 4 hours later. I brought nothing with me except the clothes I wore and the identification chip embedded in my left wrist. The station occupied a massive industrial space in the lower reaches of Sector Gamma, where the hive structure's architecture began to transition from human-scale corridors to the enormous load-bearing columns and reinforcement struts that supported the unimaginable mass of the city above. Tens of thousands of conscripts filled the processing area. All of us male, all of us between the ages of 16 and 35, all of us selected by whatever algorithmic process the administratum employed to identify expendable labor resources. A commissar stood on a raised platform at the center of the chamber. He wore the standard black uniform and peaked cap that the Departamento Munitorum issued to enforcement personnel. He did not introduce himself. He simply activated a voxcaster system and began speaking in a voice that echoed across the metal walls. "You have been selected to serve the God Emperor," he began, and I felt the reflexive response that had been drilled into us during youth conditioning. Straighten posture, focus attention, prepare for instructions. The response was automatic. I did not generate it consciously. It had been calibrated into my nervous system through repetition until it functioned as reliably as any other motor reflex. I need to pause here and state something clearly. That phrase, the one he used. I was taught to recognize it as the highest form of purpose. The institutional doctrine of the ecclesiarchy presented it as sacred duty. I repeated it during the mandatory prayer sessions in the youth preparation facility. I recited it when the overseer at the recaf plant delivered casualty reports after equipment failures killed 3 workers in a pipe rupture incident. But I never witnessed any protective presence respond to those words. I never observed any divine intervention alter outcomes for those who died, reciting that phrase as they burned or suffocated or were crushed beneath machinery. The words served an institutional function. They reinforced our acceptance of the system's demands. They were not designed to help us. They were designed to prevent us from refusing. The commissar continued speaking. He explained that the Hive City's population had exceeded projected expansion capacity by approximately 400 million individuals over the past 3 generations. The city could not build upward any further. The structural engineers had calculated that additional vertical construction would exceed the load-bearing tolerance of the existing support columns, resulting in catastrophic collapse of entire sectors. The only solution was expansion downward into the planetary crust, where new habitation and industrial zones could be excavated to accommodate the endless growth of the population. He described this as our sacred duty, our privilege, our opportunity to serve the Imperium's expansion needs. What he did not explain, what I only understood once I descended into the excavation zones, was that we were being sent to dig our own graves and call them new cities. The processing procedure took 6 hours. They logged our identification data, issued us excavation work gear, thick, rubberized suits with integrated cooling systems that wheezed when they functioned properly, and assigned us to drill crews based on criteria they never explained. I was placed in Crew 47, Deep Bore Section Epsilon 3. The crew consisted of 37 men. I never learned most of their names. The turnover rate did not justify the effort of memorization. The descent took 4 hours. We rode an industrial lift platform down through the hive structure's existing levels, past the habitation zones where ordinary citizens lived in cramped corridors stacked on top of each other like components in an endless machine. We descended past the manufactorum districts where the air tasted like metal and chemical runoff. We continued past the waste reclamation sectors, where the biological output of billions of humans was processed into something the system could reuse. We kept descending past the lowest levels I had ever heard described in orientation materials, down into zones that existed only as engineering designations on administratum schematic files that most citizens never saw. The temperature increased as we descended. The cooling system in my work suit activated automatically when the ambient heat exceeded 40 degrees. By the time we reached the excavation staging area, the temperature had climbed to 63 degrees, and the cooling system was struggling to maintain tolerable conditions inside the suit. The excavation zone was unlike anything I had been conditioned to expect. The hive structure above us, the levels where humans lived and worked, had been constructed with at least minimal consideration for human occupation. Corridors were sized to permit movement. Lighting was installed to enable navigation. Ventilation systems circulated air that could support respiration, even if the quality was poor. The excavation zone contained none of those accommodations. We stood in an enormous cavern that extended beyond the range of the portable illumination systems. The walls were raw rock, still glowing faintly red from the heat of the excavation process. The floor consisted of uneven rubble and stone fragments that the drill crews had not yet cleared. The air was thick with dust and steam from the geothermal vents that had been punctured during the drilling process. The temperature, even with the cooling suit functioning at maximum capacity, made every breath feel like inhaling heated metal shavings. The drill machines occupied the far end of the cavern. I need to describe these machines carefully, because their scale cannot be communicated through approximation. Each machine was a cylindrical structure approximately 100 meters long and 30 meters in diameter. The front section consisted of rotating drill heads studded with diamond carbide cutting teeth, each tooth the size of a man's torso. Behind the drill head, the machine's body housed enormous engines that burned promethium fuel and generated the power required to drive the cutting mechanism through solid rock. The rear section contained the crew compartment, a reinforced metal box where 20 workers operated the machine's control systems during excavation operations. We were told the machines were sacred instruments of the Omnissiah's will. The tech priest who supervised the drill operations recited a blessing over each machine before the shift began. A long sequence of phrases in a language I did not recognize, accompanied by the application of sacred oils to the machine's exterior panels. I watched the tech priest perform the ritual during my first shift. I observed him carefully applying the oil compound to specific locations on the machine's hull, while speaking the prescribed words. The machine's engine ignited approximately 30 seconds after he completed the procedure. I later learned that the oil compound was a specialized lubricant mixture designed to reduce friction in the machine's primary drive shaft, and that the 30-second delay was simply the time required for the ignition sequence to complete its automated startup cycle. The ritual served to frame routine maintenance as sacred mystery. The machine functioned because the mechanical systems had been properly maintained, not because any spirit had acknowledged the tech priest's words, but the workers believed the ritual was necessary. They had been conditioned to interpret the machine's operation as evidence of the Omnissiah's approval. That belief made them compliant. It prevented them from questioning why we were being sent to dig tunnels through rock so hot it glowed in the darkness. My assignment was designated as Excavation Support Crew Member. The role involved the following tasks: clearing debris from the drill path, managing the coolant systems that prevented the drill from overheating, monitoring the structural integrity of the newly excavated tunnels, and retrieving the bodies of workers who died during operations. That final task was not listed in the official job description. I discovered it was part of my duties when a support column collapsed during my third shift and crushed 2 men who had been standing beneath it. The crew supervisor, a man named Hakan, whose face was scarred from previous excavation accidents, simply pointed at the bodies and told me to move them to the corpse collection area before they began to decompose in the heat. I had never touched a dead body before that moment. The first man's skull had been crushed flat by the falling column. I could not see his face, only the misshapen mass of bone and tissue that remained. The second man was intact except for his torso, which had been compressed to approximately half its normal thickness. His eyes were still open. I remember thinking he looked surprised, as though death had interrupted him in the middle of a thought he had not finished processing. I dragged both bodies to the collection area, a section of the cavern where corpses were stacked in rows before the reclamation servitors arrived to process them into something the administratum could reuse. I counted 43 bodies in the collection area during that shift. The reclamation servitors arrived 6 hours later and removed 31 of them. The remaining 12 were still there when I returned for the next shift. I'm dwelling on this detail because I need you to understand that death was not exceptional in the excavation zones. It was environmental, part of the standard operational parameters. The casualty rate was calculated into the production quotas. The administratum knew how many workers would die per cubic meter of excavated rock, and they adjusted the conscription lottery accordingly to maintain the required labor force size. We were not people to the system. We were consumable components with predictable failure rates. The work proceeded in 16-hour shifts with 8 hours of rest period between each shift. During the rest period, we slept in barracks located in the staging area. Massive chambers carved from the rock, where thousands of workers occupied bunks stacked 4 high in rows that extended beyond the range of the lighting systems. The temperature in the barracks never dropped below 57 degrees. The ventilation was minimal. The air tasted like sulfur, and human sweat concentrated into a density that made breathing feel like drowning in someone else's exhalation. I slept poorly during those rest periods, not because of the discomfort. I had been conditioned since childhood to function in uncomfortable environments. I slept poorly because I kept calculating the depth. The administratum documentation stated that the original Hive City surface level was designated as Level 0. The mid-tier residential zones where I'd lived occupied Level 42, which placed them approximately 4.2 kilometers below Level 0. The excavation staging area was located at Level 97, 9.7 kilometers below the original surface. Each shift, we drilled deeper. Each day, we descended further into the planet's crust, carving out new caverns that would eventually be converted into habitation zones for the billions of humans who kept being born in the levels above us. I tried to imagine 9.7 kilometers of rock and metal and human habitation stacked above my head. I tried to visualize the weight, pressing down on the structural columns and support struts that prevented the entire mass from collapsing into the spaces we were excavating. The calculation did not resolve into anything my mind could properly process. The scale was too large. The weight was too absolute. So I stopped trying to imagine it. I simply continued working. The drill advanced at a rate of approximately 12 meters per 16-hour shift. The process was continuous. The machine never stopped cutting. The rotating drill head ground through the rock at a constant rate, reducing solid stone to rubble and heat and choking dust clouds that the ventilation system struggled to clear. The noise was continuous, a grinding, shrieking vibration that penetrated through the ear protection equipment and made my skull ache after the first 3 hours of each shift. I learned to categorize the sounds the drill made. Each type of rock produced a different frequency of noise when the cutting teeth ground through it. Granite made a high-pitched shriek. Basalt produced a deeper grinding sound. When we encountered pockets of softer sedimentary rock, the noise dropped to a rumbling vibration that I could feel in my chest cavity. And when we hit geothermal vents, the sound changed entirely. The first time I heard a drill breach a geothermal vent, I was standing approximately 40 meters behind the machine, monitoring the coolant flow rate. The drill head was cutting through a section of particularly dense rock, some type of igneous formation that the tech priests had identified as thermally active substrate. The grinding noise had been steady for approximately 2 hours when it suddenly changed pitch. The new sound was sharper, more irregular. The drill was encountering something that was not solid rock. Then the machine stopped advancing. For approximately 5 seconds, the drill head continued rotating without making forward progress. I watched the crew supervisor, Hakan, move toward the machine's control compartment, probably intending to investigate the obstruction. Then the drill head broke through. The sound was like something massive exhaling directly into the cavern. A blast of superheated steam erupted from the breach point, filling the tunnel with a white cloud that obscured everything beyond 3 meters. The temperature inside my cooling suit spiked by 15 degrees in approximately 2 seconds. The emergency alarm in my helmet began screaming, a high-pitched tone that indicated life-threatening heat exposure. I ran backward, away from the breach point, following the training protocol they had drilled into us during orientation. Behind me, I heard other workers doing the same, boots pounding on broken rock, the wheeze of cooling systems straining at a maximum capacity. Someone screaming something I could not pass over the alarm noise. The steam cleared after approximately 90 seconds. When visibility returned, I saw that the drill head had punched through into a natural geothermal vent, a fissure in the planetary crust where superheated gases and molten material rose from deeper within the planet's mantle. The vent was approximately 2 meters wide. Heat radiated from the opening in visible waves. The rock surrounding the breach point glowed orange. Hakan stood near the machine's control compartment, assessing the situation. He consulted a data slate for approximately 20 seconds, then activated his Vox communicator and reported the breach to the tech priest supervisor. The tech priest's response came through the Vox system clearly enough for everyone in the tunnel to hear, "Seal the vent and continue excavation. The Emperor's work permits no delays." That phrase again. the institutional doctrine's standard justification for continuing operations regardless of risk. It did not reference any genuine protective presence. It simply invoked the system's authority to override individual safety considerations. Hakan acknowledged the order and organized a sealing crew. 6 workers, I was not among them, approached the breach point with specialized equipment: heat-resistant sealant compounds, reinforced metal plates, and emergency cooling systems. Their task was to cover the vent opening with the metal plates and apply the sealant compound around the edges, creating a temporary seal that would contain the geothermal gases long enough for the drill to advance past the compromised section. I watched them work from a distance of approximately 50 meters. The heat radiating from the vent was sufficient to make the air shimmer even at that range. The sealing crew moved slowly, their cooling suits laboring to maintain survivable temperatures. They positioned the first metal plate over the vent opening. One of them began applying the sealant compound along the edges. Then the vent pressure increased. I do not know what caused the pressure change. Perhaps the drill breach had altered the vent's internal dynamics. Perhaps the pressure had been building naturally and simply reached a critical threshold at that moment. The cause does not alter what occurred. The metal plate shot off the vent opening like a projectile. It struck one of the sealing crew members in the chest, a man whose name I never learned, and sent him backward approximately 7 meters. He hit the cavern wall and did not move again. Superheated gas poured from the vent opening in a continuous stream. The temperature in the tunnel spiked again. My cooling suit's alarm reached a new frequency. Continuous, no longer pulsing. Critical heat exposure warning. The remaining 5 members of the sealing crew attempted to retreat. 3 of them succeeded. 2 did not move quickly enough. I watched their cooling suits fail. The process was rapid. First, the suit's exterior panels began to discolor, the heat-resistant material changing from dull gray to a darker shade that looked almost liquid. Then the internal cooling systems overloaded. I could hear the emergency alarms in their helmets from 50 meters away. Screaming electronic wails that went on for approximately 8 seconds before abruptly cutting off. Then the men inside the suits began to cook. I need to be precise about what I observed because approximation would diminish the horror of it. Human tissue does not burn cleanly in the absence of open flame. When exposed to sufficient heat while contained inside a sealed environment, it essentially steams. The moisture inside the body converts to vapor. The fats begin to liquefy, and the entire mass of tissue softens and separates from the skeletal structure. I watched both men collapse as their bodies lost structural integrity inside their suits. They fell slowly. Not the sudden drop of a person losing consciousness, but a gradual sinking as the contents of their suits ceased to maintain human shape. One of them remained partially upright for approximately 15 seconds, held in position by the suit's rigid frame, before finally toppling sideways. The smell reached us shortly after. Even through the helmet's air filtration system, I could detect the specific odor of burning organic material mixed with vaporized synthetic compounds from the suits. It was not the same smell as cooked meat. It was sharper, more chemical. I can still generate the sensory impression 3 decades later if I focus on that memory file. Hakan ordered an immediate evacuation of the forward tunnel section. We retreated to the staging area, while the tech priests organized a specialized containment crew equipped with more robust heat shielding. The vent was eventually sealed using enhanced equipment and a different approach. They pumped liquid coolant into the vent opening until the temperature dropped enough to permit installation of a reinforced seal. The process took 6 hours. During those 6 hours, I sat in the barracks area and tried to process what I had witnessed. I kept returning to a specific detail, the man whose name I never learned, who had been struck by the metal plate and killed instantly against the cavern wall. He had died quickly, probably without significant pain. His death was preferable to what the other two experienced. I recognized that I was categorizing their deaths by degree of horror, ranking them, identifying which method of dying was most tolerable. This was not a thought process I had engaged in before my conscription. I had been 19 years old and working in a recaf processing facility. My concerns had involved shift schedules and whether the filtration equipment would fail during my watch. I had not developed the mental frameworks required to evaluate the relative quality of different death experiences. 3 weeks in the excavation zones had recalibrated my thought patterns to accommodate those calculations as routine cognitive operations. The drill resumed operations after the vent was sealed. We continued advancing deeper into the planet's crust at the standard rate of 12 meters per 16-hour shift. The bodies of the 3 workers who died during the vent breach were collected and removed to the corpse reclamation area. Their deaths were logged in the casualty documentation system. The administratum sent notification to whatever family members they had in the hive levels above. The conscription lottery selected 3 new workers to replace them. The machine did not pause. The work did not stop. I continued in this operational cycle for approximately 4 months. Wake, descend to the active excavation zone. Work for 16 hours, clearing debris, monitoring systems, occasionally retrieving bodies. Return to the barracks. Sleep for 8 hours. Repeat. The drill advanced 1,460 meters during those 4 months. We descended from level 97 to level 112. The temperature in the excavation zones increased proportionally with depth. By the end of the 4th month, the ambient temperature in the active tunnels regularly exceeded 80 degrees even with the industrial cooling systems operating at full capacity. Our personal cooling suits required maintenance every 3 shifts instead of every 10. The failure rate increased. Workers began dying from heat exposure in addition to the usual cave-ins, equipment malfunctions, and geothermal breaches. The administratum adjusted the casualty projections and increased the conscription rate accordingly. I learned during this period that I could become accustomed to almost anything if exposed to it consistently over sufficient duration. The heat that had been unbearable during my first week became merely uncomfortable by the 3rd month. The constant noise of the drill machinery, which had given me severe headaches initially, faded into background environmental data that my consciousness no longer processed as distinct information. Even the regular presence of corpses in the collection area ceased to generate significant emotional response after I had dragged approximately 30 bodies to that location. This concerned me more than the physical discomfort. I recognized that I was losing the psychological frameworks that had defined my identity as a human person. The emotions and responses that had once been automatic, shock at witnessing death, horror at seeing bodies destroyed, fear when confronted with life-threatening conditions, were degrading into muted signals that my consciousness categorized as irrelevant noise. I was becoming optimized for my environment the way the machines were optimized for drilling through rock. I was being converted into a functional component of the excavation system. Not through any single dramatic transformation, but through gradual erosion of the characteristics that had distinguished me as an individual person rather than an operational unit. I tried to resist this process. I attempted to maintain connection to my previous life by deliberately accessing memories of my father, of the habitation unit where we had lived, of the relatively tolerable existence I had experienced in the recaf processing facility. But the memories became increasingly difficult to retrieve. They felt distant, irrelevant to my current operational requirements. My consciousness was reprioritizing its resource allocation toward information that had survival value in my immediate environment. Drill sounds indicating dangerous rock types, structural weakness patterns in newly excavated tunnels, early warning signs of geothermal vent proximity. The person I had been was being archived as obsolete data, while my consciousness optimized itself for the present environment. And I understood with growing certainty that this was the intended outcome. The administratum did not require us to remain human, it required us to remain functional. Our individual identities, our emotions, our connections to previous lives, these were irrelevant to our operational purpose. We were being processed into components that could efficiently excavate rock under conditions that would rapidly destroy unmodified human workers. The conditioning was not intentional in the sense of being a designed program. It was simply the natural result of exposing human consciousness to sufficiently extreme conditions for extended duration. The environment modified us because we could not survive in it otherwise. I am providing extensive detail about these first 4 months because I need you to understand that my transformation began long before the incident in month 5. The incident simply accelerated a process that was already underway. The incident occurred during a routine excavation shift in a newly opened tunnel section at level 114. We had been drilling through a formation of dense metamorphic rock for approximately 3 days. Slow progress, constant equipment strain, temperature exceeding 85 degrees at the drill face. The tech priests were frustrated by the slow advance rate. They increased the drill's rotation speed by 12% and boosted the forward pressure system to maximum operational capacity. I was monitoring the structural integrity of the tunnel walls approximately 30 meters behind the drill when I noticed something irregular. The rock formation we were cutting through was supposed to be stable metamorphic substrate, the kind of dense, solid material that required intense drilling force but provided excellent structural support once excavated. But the walls of the newly cut tunnel section were showing microfracture patterns that did not match the expected stress distribution. I reported the observation to Hakan. He examined the fracture patterns with a handheld structural scanner, consulted the excavation documentation on his data slate, and determined that my observation was accurate. The rock was not behaving like stable metamorphic formation. It was showing stress characteristics more typical of fractured volcanic substrate, material that had been subjected to extreme heat and pressure in ways that compromised its structural integrity. Hakan reported this to the tech priest supervisor and recommended an immediate halt to excavation pending further geological assessment. The tech priest's response was unambiguous. Continue drilling. The Emperor's work cannot be delayed by cautious speculation. That phrase, again, deployed as justification for overriding legitimate safety concerns. It did not reference any protective presence that would ensure our survival if we continued into unsafe conditions. It simply invoked institutional authority to compel compliance with production requirements regardless of risk. Hakan acknowledged the order. He did not argue. Arguments were not part of the operational protocol. We returned to our positions and the drill continued advancing. The tunnel collapse began approximately 40 minutes later. I heard the sound before I felt the movement, a deep groaning noise that seemed to come from everywhere at once, as though the rock itself was exhaling. Then the vibration started. Small tremors that made dust fall from the tunnel ceiling in thin streams. The tremors intensified rapidly, progressing from minor vibration to visible movement of the tunnel walls in approximately 15 seconds. Someone shouted a warning. I do not remember who. The evacuation alarm began wailing. I turned and ran toward the staging area, following the emergency lighting strips embedded in the tunnel floor. Behind me, I heard the first section of tunnel ceiling give way. The sound was enormous. Not a single crash, but a continuous roaring thunder as hundreds of tons of rock broke free from the ceiling and fell into the excavation tunnel. The vibration from the impact traveled through the ground and nearly knocked me off balance. Dust filled the tunnel in a dense cloud that reduced visibility to approximately 2 meters. I kept running. Others ran with me. Figures barely visible in the dust cloud, the lights on their helmets bouncing erratically. Someone fell near me. I did not stop to help them. Stopping would have violated the evacuation protocol. Individual survival took precedence over assistance when collapse events occurred. I reached the staging area approximately 90 seconds after the collapse began. I turned to count how many others had made it out. 12 workers had been in the forward tunnel section when the collapse started. 7 of us reached the staging area. 5 did not. The tech priests sealed the collapsed tunnel section and rerouted the excavation plan to circumvent the unstable rock formation. The bodies of the 5 workers who died in the collapse were designated as non-recoverable. They were buried under too much rubble to make retrieval operationally efficient. Their deaths were logged in the casualty documentation system. The conscription lottery selected 5 new workers to replace them. The drill was redirected to a new tunnel alignment and resumed operations 16 hours after the collapse event. I sat in the barracks during the 16-hour pause and tried to identify what I was feeling. I recognized that I should be experiencing fear, horror, grief for the 5 men who died, anger at the tech priest who had ordered us to continue drilling despite the identified structural risks. But I could not generate those emotional responses with any intensity that felt authentic. They registered as faint background signals, like trying to hear a distant conversation through multiple walls, present but muted to the point of operational irrelevance. What I felt instead was a kind of cold analytical assessment. The collapse had occurred. 5 workers had been lost. The system had responded according to its standard protocols. New workers had been assigned. The excavation would continue. These were simply facts to be processed and filed. I understood in that moment that I had crossed a threshold I could not locate precisely in my memory timeline. At some point during the previous 4 months, I had stopped being the person who had reported to Processing Station 91 with my father's final words still echoing in my mind. That person had been archived, overwritten, replaced with something more operationally suitable for the excavation environment. I was not becoming a machine, not in any literal sense, but I was becoming something that could function in the same spaces as machines, with the same emotional relationship to casualties and continued operation. I was becoming a component. And the most disturbing aspect of this recognition was that I could identify the process occurring while simultaneously being unable to prevent or reverse it. My consciousness remained intact enough to observe its own modification, but not intact enough to resist. The system was optimizing me, and I was allowing it because resistance required resources I no longer possessed. The excavation continued for another 8 months after the tunnel collapse incident. I descended further into the planet's crust, working at depths that would eventually reach level 137, 13.7 kilometers below the Hive City's original surface level. The conditions deteriorated proportionally with depth. The temperature in the active excavation zones regularly exceeded 95 degrees. The geothermal vent breaches became more frequent. We encountered them approximately once every 36 hours of drilling operations instead of once every few weeks. The structural collapse rate increased. The casualty count grew steadily higher month over month, and the population above continued to expand. Billions of new births each generation, all requiring space that the hive structure could no longer provide through vertical construction. So we kept drilling deeper, kept excavating new caverns that would be converted into habitation zones for populations that had not yet been born. We were digging tombs and calling them homes. I am reaching the point where my testimony must describe the event that resulted in my current condition. I need to stop here and confirm that you want me to continue to that section. The event that resulted in my current condition occurred during excavation operations at level 139. By this point, I'd been working in the excavation corps for 1 year and 3 months. I was 20 standard years old, though the concept of age had become increasingly abstract. Time in the deep excavation zones did not function the way it had in the upper hive levels. There were no day-night cycles, no natural environmental markers to distinguish one period from another. Only the shift schedules, 16 hours of work, 8 hours of rest, repeating indefinitely in an unbroken sequence that made individual days blur into an undifferentiated stream of excavation operations. I no longer thought about my father with any frequency. The memory files were still accessible if I deliberately queried them, but they had ceased to surface spontaneously. The habitation unit where we had lived existed in my recollection as a set of dimensional measurements and visual data points. 3 meters by 5 meters, gray walls, a filtration vent in the upper left corner. But the emotional associations that should have accompanied those details had degraded to the point where I could not reliably reconstruct what it had felt like to occupy that space as a home, rather than as a temporary shelter between work assignments. I recognized this as evidence of continued cognitive modification. but the recognition generated no significant concern response. My consciousness had accepted that the person I had been was operationally obsolete. Maintaining connection to that obsolete identity served no function in my current environment. I was becoming efficient. The excavation work at level 139 involved cutting through a formation that the tech priests identified as thermally compromised transitional substrate. This classification meant the rock had been subjected to extreme heat over geological time periods, creating a structure that was neither fully metamorphic nor fully igneous, but something intermediate and unstable. The formation was shot through with micro-fissures and pockets of trapped gas that had been superheated by proximity to the planet's mantle. The drilling proceeded slowly. The machine advanced approximately 8 meters per 16-hour shift instead of the standard 12. The reduced progress rate created pressure from the administratum overseers, who monitored production quotas and issued increasingly urgent directives demanding faster excavation. The tech priest supervisor responded by increasing the drill's operational parameters beyond standard safety margins. Higher rotation speed, greater forward pressure, reduced cooling intervals. The machine was being pushed into operational ranges that its design specifications classified as extreme risk conditions. I observed this process with the same analytical detachment I now applied to most situations. The increased operational tempo would accelerate equipment degradation and increase casualty probability. These were predictable outcomes. The system had calculated that the production benefit outweighed the increased resource cost. My role was to continue performing my assigned functions until circumstances prevented me from doing so. The crew I worked with during this period had almost entirely turned over from the original group I had been assigned to in my first week. Of the 37 workers who had comprised Crew 47 at the beginning, only 4 remained. Myself and 3 others, whose names were Kelvin, Jaren, and Torvek. The rest had been killed in various excavation incidents or transferred to different work assignments. Their replacements cycled through at a rate that made memorization inefficient. Kelvin was 23 years old and had been working in the excavation zones for 18 months longer than I had. His cooling suit showed extensive repair patches from multiple heat exposure incidents. He spoke rarely, and when he did, his voice carried a particular flat quality that I recognized in my own speech patterns. The absence of emotional modulation that resulted from extended operation in environments where emotional expression served no survival function. Jaren was younger, 17, though he claimed to be 19 because the conscription lottery was not supposed to select workers under 18. Nobody challenged his claim. The system required bodies to operate the excavation machinery, and it did not allocate resources to verify age documentation when the practical difference was irrelevant to operational capability. Torvek was the oldest worker in our crew, 31 years, which was approximately 7 years beyond the average life expectancy for excavation workers. He had survived by developing an almost mechanical precision in his work movements, eliminating all wasted motion and maintaining constant awareness of structural conditions and equipment status. He moved through the excavation zones like a component that had been perfectly calibrated for its environment. I studied his behavioral patterns because I understood that they represented successful adaptation to conditions that killed most workers within the first 18 months. I was becoming more like Torvik with each passing shift, more precise, more mechanical, more efficiently stripped of the characteristics that had once defined me as an individual person rather than an operational unit. The incident occurred during the 47th hour of a drilling push through a particularly dense section of the transitional substrate formation. We had been operating continuously for 3 standard shifts, with only brief pauses for equipment, maintenance, and crew rotation. The drill was showing signs of stress, elevated vibration readings, increased heat output from the primary drive shaft, intermittent fluctuations in rotation speed that indicated bearing degradation. Hakan had reported these conditions to the tech priest supervisor twice during the previous 12 hours and recommended a maintenance halt to replace the worn components before catastrophic failure occurred. The tech priest had denied both requests, citing production quotas and invoking, again, the phrase about sacred duty and intolerable delay. I was positioned approximately 25 meters behind the drill, monitoring the coolant system flow rates, when I heard the sound change. The drill had been producing its standard operating noise, the grinding roar of carbide teeth pulverizing rock at high rotation speeds. But underneath that familiar noise, a new sound had emerged, higher-pitched, more irregular, a rhythmic squealing that occurred once per revolution of the drill head. I recognized it as a bearing failure warning. One of the primary drive shaft bearings was deteriorating, creating metal-on-metal friction that would rapidly accelerate into complete structural failure if operations continued. I reported this to Hakan over the Vox system. He acknowledged and moved toward the drill's control compartment to initiate emergency shutdown procedures. He did not complete that action. The bearing failed catastrophically before he reached the control panel. The sound was sharp and immediate, a metallic crack that cut through the drill's operational noise like a blade through fabric. Then the drill head's rotation pattern changed. Instead of smooth, continuous rotation, it began to wobble, the cutting teeth striking the rock face at irregular angles and creating enormous lateral stress on the drive shaft. The drive shaft fractured 12 seconds later. I watched the drill head separate from the machine's body. The momentum of rotation carried it forward into the rock face at an angle, where it struck with sufficient force to shatter several of the diamond carbide teeth and send metal fragments spraying backward through the tunnel like projectiles. One fragment, approximately the size of my fist, struck Jaren in the chest. The impact punched through his cooling suit and continued through his torso, emerging from his back in a spray of tissue and suit material. He fell without making any sound. Other fragments struck the tunnel walls and ricocheted unpredictably. I heard someone scream, a sound abruptly cut off. More impacts, the specific noise of metal striking flesh, which is duller and more final than metal striking stone. I dropped behind a support strut and remained there until the fragment spray stopped, approximately 8 seconds after the initial drive shaft failure. When I emerged from cover, I counted 6 workers down in the immediate area. Jaren was clearly dead. The fragment had destroyed too much of his internal structure to permit survival even if immediate medical intervention had been available, which it was not. 3 others were also motionless, their bodies positioned in ways that indicated they had died quickly. 2 were still moving. One was Torvik, A fragment had struck his left leg below the knee, nearly severing it. He was attempting to apply a tourniquet to the limb using a length of cable, his movements precise despite the severity of the injury. His face showed no expression. He worked on his own damaged leg with the same mechanical efficiency he applied to all tasks. The other was Kelvin. He had been struck in the abdomen by a smaller fragment that had penetrated his cooling suit without creating an immediately lethal wound. He was conscious, attempting to seal the breach in his suit with emergency repair compound, while blood spread across the suit's interior fabric in a dark stain that grew steadily larger. I moved to assist Kelvin first because his injury appeared more immediately survivable than Torvek's. I helped him apply the repair compound to seal the suit breach, then assisted him in moving to a position where he could apply pressure to the abdominal wound. He did not speak during this process. Neither did I. The situation did not require verbal communication. Hakan was organizing the evacuation and casualty response. He directed me and 2 other workers to move the injured to the staging area while he coordinated with the tech priests to secure the damaged drill machinery and assess the structural integrity of the tunnel section. I helped carry Kelvin to the staging area. His breathing had become shallow and rapid. Early shock response from blood loss. I calculated that he would require medical intervention within approximately 30 minutes to maintain survival probability above 50%. The staging area's medical facility consisted of 1 partially trained medici assistant and a supply of basic wound treatment materials. The medici assistant examined Kelvin's injury, applied additional pressure dressings, and administered a stimulant compound to stabilize his cardiovascular function. He logged Kelvin's status as critical, requires transport to upper-level medical facility, and moved on to assess the next casualty. No transport was arranged. I remained near Kelvin for approximately 20 minutes, during which his condition continued to deteriorate. The bleeding was not fully controlled despite the pressure dressings. His consciousness began to fragment. He spoke in disconnected phrases that did not form coherent meaning. He repeated a sequence of numbers that might have been an identification code or a memory of some other origin. Then he stopped speaking, and his breathing changed to a pattern I recognized from previous casualty observations. He died 47 minutes after being wounded. The medici assistant logged his death and directed me to move the body to the corpse collection area. I performed this task with the same mechanical precision I now applied to all actions. Kelvin's body weighed approximately 70 kilograms. I calculated the most efficient method to transport it. Fireman's carry, using the major muscle groups in my legs and core to distribute the load. I walked the 130 meters to the collection area, placed the body in an open position in the organized rows, and returned to the staging area to receive new task assignments. I felt nothing during this process that I could categorize as grief. I recognized that Kelvin had been present in my work environment for the past year. We had performed tasks in proximity to each other. We had occasionally exchanged functional information about equipment status or structural conditions. These interactions had occurred. They were logged in my memory as factual records. But the emotional significance that should have accompanied those memories, the sense of loss, the recognition of a person rather than just a functional unit being removed from operation, was absent. or so degraded that I could no longer distinguish it from background noise. I understood in that moment that I had completed a transformation I had observed beginning months earlier. I was no longer the person who had been conscripted from the recaf processing facility. That person would have experienced horror at watching Jaren die, would have felt grief at Kelvin's death, would have been disturbed by his own increasing capacity to treat human bodies as operational units rather than as people. But that person no longer existed in any form that could be meaningfully retrieved. The consciousness that remained was something different, something that had been optimized for survival in an environment where emotional responses to death were maladaptive because death occurred too frequently to process each incident with the psychological weight it would have carried in normal human contexts. I had become a functional component of the excavation system. My identity as an individual person had been archived as operationally obsolete data. What remained was a consciousness that could efficiently process tasks, monitor conditions, and continue operating in conditions that would destroy anyone who maintained connection to normal human emotional architecture. The system had succeeded in converting me into exactly what it required, and I had allowed this to occur because resistance would have required maintaining psychological frameworks that were incompatible with survival in my operational environment. The drill machinery was repaired over the following 72 hours. The damaged drive shaft was replaced with a refurbished component salvaged from a decommissioned machine in an upper-level excavation zone. The drill head was reconnected and recalibrated. The tech priests performed their rituals, applying sacred oils to the new components, reciting their prescribed phrases in the language I did not understand. The machine functioned after the ritual was completed, not because any spirit had acknowledged the tech priest's words, but because the mechanical repairs had been properly executed, and the replacement components were dimensionally compatible with the existing system architecture. But the workers believed the ritual had restored the machine's sacred function. I heard them speaking in the barracks during rest periods, attributing the successful repair to the Omnissiah's blessing rather than to the tech priest's technical competence. They had been conditioned to interpret mechanical causation as spiritual intervention. That conditioning made them compliant with the system's demands and prevented them from recognizing that they were being systematically consumed by machinery that operated according to purely physical principles with no divine oversight or protection. I no longer engaged in such conversations. I had stopped participating in the social behaviors that occurred during rest periods. The exchanges of speculation about conditions in other excavation zones, the sharing of memories from life in the upper hive levels, the occasional attempts at humor that briefly interrupted the otherwise unrelenting grimness of our existence. These behaviors served no function in my current operational framework. They were remnants of the social architecture that had defined human interaction in environments where people existed as individuals rather than as components. I had been optimized beyond the point where those behaviors were relevant to my survival or efficiency. Torvek noticed this change. He approached me during a rest period approximately 1 week after the drill failure incident. He sat on the bunk adjacent to mine. We were positioned in the same section of the barracks, though I could not determine if this was intentional assignment or random distribution. He spoke without preamble, his voice carrying the same flat effect that characterized all his communications. "You have crossed the threshold." I did not respond immediately. I was uncertain what threshold he was referencing, though I suspected it related to the psychological transition I had identified in myself. He continued without waiting for my response. "The point where continued operation becomes preferable to resistance, where efficiency replaces identity as the primary organizing principle. You no longer fight the modification. You accept it as necessary adaptation." His description was accurate. I acknowledged this with a slight movement of my head that served as non-verbal confirmation. He was silent for approximately 15 seconds. Then he spoke again. "This is the intended outcome. The system does not require us to remain human in any meaningful sense. It requires us to remain functional. The excavation must continue regardless of what we become in the process. You are now optimized for that purpose." I processed his statement and recognized it as consistent with my own conclusions. The administratum did not design the modification process intentionally. It simply created environmental conditions that systematically eroded human psychological architecture until what remained was something that could function efficiently in those conditions. The transformation was a natural consequence of extended exposure to an environment that was fundamentally incompatible with normal human existence. I asked him a question that had been forming in my consciousness for several weeks, but which I had not yet articulated. "How long have you been operating in this condition?" He was silent for a longer period this time, approximately 30 seconds. When he spoke, his voice had not changed in affect, but the content carried information that reframed my understanding of the transformation process. 13 years. I had calculated that the average operational lifespan of an excavation worker was approximately 18 months. Torvik had been operating for more than 8 times that duration. His survival represented a statistical outlier of significant magnitude. I asked the logical follow-up question: "How have you maintained operational capability for that duration?" His response was immediate and precise: "By accepting that I am no longer the person who was conscripted. That person died during the first year. What continues is a functional remnant that shares his memory architecture, but none of his identity. I do not resist the modification. I do not attempt to maintain connection to human emotional frameworks. I operate as a component within the system's machinery, and the system has no reason to dispose of me as long as I continue to function efficiently." I understood the implication. Torvik had survived by completing the transformation I was currently undergoing. By accepting the complete erosion of his individual identity and restructuring his consciousness around pure operational efficiency. He had become a component so thoroughly that the system treated him as reliable machinery, rather than as an expendable human resource. This represented a form of survival, but it was survival that required the permanent sacrifice of every characteristic that had defined him as a person rather than as an object. I asked him the question that seemed most relevant: "Do you experience this as preferable to death?" He was silent for an extended period, approximately 60 seconds. When he finally responded, his voice had not changed, but his words carried weight that suggested the question had engaged some remnant of evaluative capacity that still functioned in his modified consciousness. I continue. I do not terminate. These are the only meaningful distinctions in our operational environment. Whether continuation is preferable to termination depends on frameworks I no longer possess the capability to access. This statement clarified my understanding of the transformation's final stage. Torvik had survived by sacrificing the cognitive architecture required to evaluate whether survival was desirable. He continued operating because termination required decision-making frameworks that his modified consciousness no longer contained. He had achieved operational immortality by becoming something that could not choose death because it could not meaningfully evaluate existence in terms of quality or desirability. This was the endpoint the system produced when human consciousness was exposed to excavation conditions for sufficient duration. Not death, but transformation into something that functioned like machinery. Continuing operation without the capacity to question whether continued operation served any purpose beyond its own perpetuation. I recognized that I was approaching that endpoint. The psychological frameworks I had once used to evaluate my circumstances in terms of suffering or meaning or purpose had already degraded significantly. If I continued operating in the excavation zones for the duration Torvik had survived, I would complete the transformation he embodied. I would become a component that continued functioning indefinitely without retaining any meaningful connection to the person I had been. The question that emerged from this recognition was whether I possessed sufficient remaining agency to prevent that outcome. I did not identify an answer. The excavation operations continued for another 3 months after my conversation with Torvik. We descended to level 146, 14.6 kilometers below the Hive City's original surface level. The temperature in the active excavation zones exceeded 100 degrees regularly. The geothermal vent breaches occurred approximately once every 18 hours. The structural collapse rate had increased to the point where tunnel reinforcement procedures consumed more operational time than the actual excavation work. The casualty count during those 3 months exceeded 400 workers just in our designated excavation sector. The administratum continued adjusting the conscription lottery to maintain the required labor force size. New workers arrived in continuous streams, were assigned to crews, operated for their brief functional lifespan, and were replaced. The system perpetuated itself with perfect mechanical efficiency. I continued performing my assigned functions with increasing precision. My error rate approached 0. My task completion speed exceeded standard efficiency benchmarks. I no longer experienced the physical discomfort that had characterized my early weeks in the excavation zones. Not because conditions had improved, but because my consciousness no longer processed discomfort as information requiring response. Pain, heat, exhaustion. These registered as data points that informed my operational adjustments, but did not generate the psychological distress they would have produced in someone who retained normal human neurological architecture. I was becoming what Torvik had described, a functional remnant that shared my original identity's memory architecture, but none of the characteristics that had defined me as a person rather than as an operational unit. And then the system made an error. The error occurred during excavation operations in a newly opened tunnel section at level 147. The geological survey data indicated we were cutting through standard transitional substrate. the same thermally compromised rock formation we had been excavating for the past several months. The drilling proceeded according to standard protocols. The advance rate was approximately 8 meters per shift. The temperature was elevated but within tolerable ranges for our equipment specifications. But the geological survey was incorrect. We were not cutting through stable transitional substrate. We were cutting through a thin shelf of rock that separated the excavation tunnel from a massive magma chamber approximately 200 meters below the planet's mantle boundary. I did not know this until the drill punched through. The breach occurred during the 33rd hour of a continuous drilling operation. I was positioned at my standard monitoring location, recording coolant flow data, when the drill's sound pattern changed abruptly. The grinding roar dropped in pitch and intensity. The characteristic sound of the cutting teeth encountering significantly less resistance than solid rock provided. For approximately 3 seconds, the reduced resistance continued. Then the drill head broke through entirely into open space. The sound that emerged from the breach point was unlike any geothermal vent I had previously encountered. It was deeper, more sustained, a continuous roaring exhalation that seemed to come from the planet's core itself. Then the heat arrived. The temperature in the tunnel spiked by 40 degrees in approximately 5 seconds. My cooling suit's emergency systems activated immediately, but they were not rated for the thermal load now flooding through the breach point. The suit's exterior panels began to discolor. The internal temperature reading on my helmet display climbed past the scale's maximum measurement threshold. I initiated evacuation procedures reflexively, turning toward the staging area and beginning to run. Around me, other workers were doing the same. The evacuation alarm was screaming. The tunnel lighting had shifted to emergency red. Behind me, I heard the rock shelf begin to fail. The breach point was expanding. The drill had weakened the thin layer of stone separating the tunnel from the magma chamber below, and the heat and pressure from that chamber were now working to enlarge the opening. Cracks radiated outward from the breach point. The tunnel floor began to vibrate with increasing intensity. I ran faster than I had ever moved in the excavation zones. My cooling suit was failing. The temperature inside had exceeded 50 degrees and continued climbing. I could feel the heat on my skin, could smell the synthetic materials of my suit beginning to degrade from thermal stress. I reached the staging area approximately 45 seconds after beginning evacuation. I turned to count survivors. 9 workers had been in the forward tunnel section. 4 of us reached the staging area. 5 did not make it out before the shelf collapsed entirely. The sound of the collapse was enormous, a deep subsonic rumble that I felt in my chest cavity more than heard through my audio receptors. The tunnel floor dropped by approximately 3 meters at the breach point, creating a yawning opening through which I could see orange light glowing from below. Magma began flowing into the tunnel through the breach point. Not rapidly. The magma was extremely viscous, moving in slow-flowing waves that crept along the tunnel floor at approximately 1 meter per minute. But the volume was enormous. Hundreds of cubic meters flowing upward from the breached chamber, filling the tunnel from floor to ceiling with molten rock that radiated heat intense enough to make the air shimmer at distances exceeding 100 meters. The tech priests initiated emergency sealing procedures immediately. They deployed specialized containment barriers, massive reinforced plates designed to block catastrophic breaches, and attempted to establish a seal between the advancing magma in the staging area. The first barrier failed within 90 seconds. The heat from the magma compromised its structural integrity before the sealing mechanism could be properly engaged. The barrier warped, buckled, and finally melted into the tunnel floor as the magma advanced past it. The tech priests deployed a second barrier at a position 30 meters further back. This one included active cooling systems. Liquid nitrogen pumped through channels in the barrier's structure to reduce the thermal load and maintain integrity long enough to establish a permanent seal. The second barrier held for approximately 8 minutes before the cooling systems failed, and it began to exhibit the same structural compromise as the first. I observed this process with the analytical detachment that now characterized all my cognitive responses. The magma was advancing at a predictable rate. The barriers were failing according to understandable physical principles. The staging area would be overrun within approximately 23 minutes if the current conditions persisted. All workers in the staging area received evacuation orders. We were directed to ascend to level 146 and establish operations at the secondary staging facility, while specialized containment teams attempted to seal the breach. The evacuation proceeded in organized sequence. Workers filed onto the lift platforms in groups of 50, ascending to the upper level in batches. The process was efficient. No panic, no disorder. We had been conditioned to respond to emergency situations with mechanical precision rather than with the emotional responses that would have characterized unmodified human populations. I was assigned to the 7th Evacuation Group. I waited in the designated assembly area while the first 6 groups boarded the lift platforms and ascended. The wait duration was approximately 18 minutes. During those 18 minutes, I watched the magma advance into the staging area. It moved slowly, but with absolute inevitability. The orange glow illuminated the massive cavern, casting shadows that shifted and flickered as the magma's surface roiled and bubbled. The heat was intense, even at a distance of more than 100 meters. My cooling suit had been damaged during the initial breach event and was no longer functioning at full capacity. The temperature inside the suit exceeded 60 degrees. I calculated that I could maintain consciousness for approximately 12 more minutes at current thermal load before heat-induced cognitive impairment would compromise my ability to execute evacuation procedures. The 6th Evacuation Group boarded the lift platform. The platform began ascending toward level 146. I moved toward the loading area, with the rest of the 7th group, preparing to board when the platform returned. The platform did not return. For approximately 90 seconds, nothing happened. The lift platform should have returned to the loading area within 60 seconds of beginning its ascent. When it did not appear on schedule, several workers began checking the lift system status indicators. Then we heard the sound, a sharp metallic screech from somewhere high above us in the lift shaft, followed by a sustained grinding noise that indicated catastrophic mechanical failure. The lift platform had failed somewhere between level 146 and level 147. 50 workers were trapped on a disabled platform suspended in a shaft with no emergency descent capability. And 473 workers remained in the staging area at level 147 with no functional evacuation route and magma advancing toward our position at 1 meter per minute. The tech priest in command of the evacuation operation consulted with the Mechanicus engineers for approximately 2 minutes, then made an announcement over the Vox system. Secondary evacuation routes are being established. All workers are to proceed to Assembly Point Delta and await further instructions. The Emperor protects those who maintain discipline and order. That phrase, again, invoked to maintain compliance in circumstances where no protection was operationally possible. It did not reference any actual protective presence. It simply deployed conditioned response patterns to prevent panic. I proceeded to Assembly Point Delta with the rest of the remaining workers. The assembly point was located at the extreme rear of the staging area, the furthest position from the advancing magma. The distance would buy us approximately 23 additional minutes before the magma flow reached our position. I calculated that the Mechanicus engineers would need to establish functional secondary evacuation routes in less than 23 minutes to prevent the loss of 473 workers. I also calculated the probability that they would succeed in doing so. The probability was not favorable. I stood in Assembly Point Delta with 472 other workers and waited while the tech priests and engineers attempted to identify alternate evacuation routes. The Vox system provided periodic updates. They were exploring emergency access shafts, attempting to repair the disabled lift platform, coordinating with upper-level excavation teams to establish rescue operations from above. The updates became less frequent as time passed. The magma continued advancing. I watched it flow into the staging area with the same mechanical inevitability that characterized all physical processes. It consumed everything in its path: equipment, structural elements, the bodies of the 5 workers who had not evacuated from the forward tunnel section before the collapse. The bodies ignited when the magma reached them, burning with bright flames that lasted approximately 40 seconds before being absorbed into the molten rock. The heat in Assembly Point Delta exceeded 70 degrees. Many workers' cooling suits were no longer functioning. I observed several individuals showing signs of advanced heat stress, disorientation, compromised motor control, unconsciousness. They collapsed where they stood. Nobody moved to assist them. Assistance would have violated our conditioning to prioritize collective efficiency over individual aid in resource-constrained scenarios. 23 minutes after we reached Assembly Point Delta, the magma flow reached the rear perimeter of the staging area. The tech priests made a final announcement over the Vox system. Evacuation routes cannot be established within required time frame. All personnel are to remain in position and maintain operational discipline. The Emperor's mercy extends to all who serve faithfully until termination. The announcement confirmed what I had already calculated. We were going to die in this location. The system had no capacity to extract us before the magma consumed our position. Our deaths would be logged in the casualty documentation system. The conscription lottery would select new workers to replace us. The excavation operations would continue. We were expendable components that had reached the end of our functional lifespan. I accepted this information with the same analytical detachment I now applied to all circumstances. My consciousness had been modified to the point where even imminent death registered primarily as a data point rather than as a source of existential terror. I would terminate. The termination would be rapid once the magma reached my position. These were simply facts to be processed, but something unexpected occurred in the final minutes before the magma reached assembly point Delta. I accessed a memory file I had not deliberately queried in more than 11 months. The memory was of my father standing in our habitation unit, his hand on my shoulder, speaking the phrase about duty and purpose that he had been conditioned to recite. I could see his face with precision. The lines around his eyes, the gray in his hair at the temples, the particular way his jaw tightened when he was suppressing emotional response. And for the first time in months, I felt something that was not analytical assessment or operational calculation. I felt grief. Not for my own approaching death. That still registered primarily as information rather than as a source of emotional distress, but for what had been done to both of us. For the system that had conditioned my father to recite institutional justifications for my conscription. For the machinery that had systematically eroded my consciousness until I became something that could watch other humans die without experiencing appropriate emotional response. For the billions of people in the hive levels above who are being processed into components by a system that perpetuated itself through scale and inertia without any genuine purpose beyond its own continuation. The grief lasted approximately 15 seconds before my modified consciousness reprocessed it as irrelevant noise and archived it as non-operational data. But during those 15 seconds, I was briefly reconnected to the person I had been before conscription, and I understood with absolute clarity what had been taken from me. The magma reached the position where I stood approximately 90 seconds after I experienced that brief moment of reconnection. I expected the termination to be rapid. The heat from direct contact with magma would destroy my cooling suit instantly and ignite my body. Consciousness would cease within seconds, but that is not what occurred. Instead, something in the rock formation beneath assembly point Delta fractured under the thermal stress. The floor gave way. I fell approximately 30 meters through collapsing stone, struck a sloping surface, and slid downward into a space I could not initially identify. When my consciousness stabilized enough to process sensory input, I recognized that I had fallen into a natural cave system, a network of voids in the rock formation that existed below the excavation staging area. The cave was large. I could not see the walls or ceiling in the dim red glow that filtered down from the opening above where the magma was flowing. I was not alone in the cave. Approximately 70 other workers had fallen through the same collapse. Most were unconscious. Several were clearly dead from impact trauma. A few, like me, were beginning to assess the situation and determine our condition. The immediate danger was the magma. It was flowing through the opening above us, accumulating in the upper sections of the cave. But the cave system was extensive. It extended downward and laterally in multiple directions. If we could navigate through the cave network, we might locate a passage that connected to other excavation zones or maintenance tunnels. It represented a small probability of survival where none had existed 30 seconds earlier. I began moving immediately, selecting the passage that appeared to slope upward at the most favorable angle. Approximately 20 other workers followed me. The rest remained near the collapse point, either too injured to move or too disoriented to process the escape option. We navigated through the cave system for what I estimated as 3 hours, though my time perception in that environment was unreliable. The caves were hot. The temperature exceeded 80 degrees throughout, and completely dark except for the helmet lights on our suits. Many of the passages were too narrow for comfortable movement. We had to crawl through sections where the ceiling was less than 1 meter high. Several workers could not continue. They collapsed from heat exhaustion or injury and did not respond to attempts at revival. We left them where they fell. Individual assistance was not operationally feasible in our resource-constrained circumstances. Eventually, we found a passage that appeared to be artificial rather than natural. The walls showed marks from drilling equipment, and the passage maintained consistent dimensions that suggested intentional excavation. We followed this passage for approximately 40 minutes until we encountered a sealed access hatch. The hatch was locked from the other side, but the locking mechanism was old. Standard mechanical components rather than the more secure electromagnetic systems used in newer infrastructure. One of the workers with us had specialized tools integrated into his work suit. He managed to force the locking mechanism after approximately 15 minutes of work. The hatch opened into a maintenance tunnel at level 132. We had survived. 11 of us, out of the 473 workers who had been trapped in the staging area, at level 147. The survival represented a statistical anomaly of extraordinary improbability. The cave system, the specific location where the floor had collapsed, the navigable passage through the caves, the artificial tunnel connection, the forcible hatch mechanism. Every element had aligned in a configuration that made survival possible where it should have been impossible. I processed this information and attempted to determine what it meant. The institutional conditioning would have interpreted our survival as evidence of divine protection. The Emperor's mercy extended to faithful servants. But I had been modified beyond the point where that interpretation could gain traction in my consciousness. I understood that our survival was the result of geological accident and probability alignment, not the intervention of any protective presence. But the fact of our survival had disrupted something in my modified cognitive architecture. I had accepted my approaching death with analytical detachment. I had completed the psychological frameworks necessary to terminate without resistance. My consciousness had been optimized to the point where continued existence versus termination were merely operational states with no meaningful distinction. And then I had survived when I should have died. This created a processing error my modified consciousness could not efficiently resolve. If termination and continuation were truly equivalent operational states, then surviving should have generated the same neutral response as dying would have. But I found myself experiencing something that resembled relief, a positive valence response to the fact of continued existence that contradicted the framework I had developed that treated continuation and termination as equally irrelevant outcomes. The inconsistency indicated that my modification was not as complete as I had assessed. Some fragment of my original consciousness remained, a fragment that still evaluated existence as preferable to termination, despite the erosion of almost all other characteristics that had defined me as a person rather than as a component. This was both unexpected and operationally significant. It suggested that complete conversion to component status was not actually achievable. that some irreducible element of human consciousness persisted regardless of how thoroughly the system optimized us for our operational environments. The 11 survivors were processed through the standard casualty documentation system. The administratum logged us as recovered with injuries rather than terminated in operational incident. We were assigned to medical evaluation and temporary recovery housing, while the Mechanicus engineers assessed the structural damage at level 147 and determined whether excavation operations could resume in that sector. The medical evaluation revealed that I had sustained significant thermal damage to my respiratory system from extended exposure to superheated air during the evacuation and cave navigation. The damage was categorized as permanent but not immediately life-threatening. My operational capacity for heavy excavation work was assessed as significantly compromised. I was reassigned. The new assignment designated me as a maintenance worker in the Deep Infrastructure Monitoring Division. My role involved inspecting the structural integrity of excavation zones that had been completed and converted into habitation or industrial areas. I would descend into the deep levels, the same zones where I had worked during my excavation service, and assessed the condition of support structures, ventilation systems, and geothermal seal integrity. The work was less physically demanding than excavation operations, but it required me to spend extended periods in the completed excavation zones, which had been converted into living spaces for the billions of humans who continued to be born in the hive levels above. I need to describe what these converted zones contained, because the horror of it exceeded even what I'd experienced in the active excavation areas. The completed zones at level 145. One of the first deep excavation sectors I was assigned to inspect had been converted into habitation blocks approximately 2 years before my reassignment to maintenance work. The administratum had installed minimal infrastructure, metal partition walls to divide the massive excavation caverns into smaller residential units, basic plumbing and waste removal systems, emergency lighting, and ventilation ducts that circulated air from the upper levels. The temperature in the habitation blocks averaged 93 degrees. There was no cooling infrastructure. The residents existed in conditions of constant heat exposure that would have been classified as life-threatening in any standard environmental assessment. But the administratum had calculated that humans could survive, not comfortably, but survivably, in those conditions if provided with adequate hydration and minimal medical intervention to manage heat-related illness. The population density was extraordinary. Each residential unit measured approximately 4 meters by 4 meters and housed an average of 8 people. The units were stacked in rows that extended through the converted caverns for distances that exceeded my visual range, even with enhanced lighting. I calculated that a single converted excavation cavern at level 145 housed approximately 200,000 people. The residents were primarily workers assigned to deep-level manufactorum operations and their families. They had been relocated from the overcrowded mid-level habitation zones to make space for the endless expansion of the hive's population. They had been told, according to the propaganda notices posted throughout the converted zones, that they were pioneering the Imperium's expansion into new territories, that their sacrifice in accepting difficult living conditions was sacred duty. but I observed what those living conditions actually consisted of. Children, some as young as 3 or 4 standard years, walking through corridors where the temperature exceeded 90 degrees, their skin flushed red from heat exposure, their movements slow with the lethargy of chronic heat exhaustion. Adults working 16-hour shifts in manufactorum facilities and returning to residential units where there was no respite from the heat, no space for privacy or rest, only the endless press of other bodies in spaces too small to accommodate them. I watched an elderly man collapse from heat-related cardiac failure while walking through one of the main corridors. He fell and did not move. People walked past him. Nobody stopped to assist, not because they were cruel, but because the environmental conditions did not permit the expenditure of additional energy on aid that was unlikely to be effective. The man's body remained in the corridor for approximately 3 hours before a reclamation servitor arrived to process it. This was the space we had excavated. The new territory we had carved from the planet's crust at the cost of hundreds of thousands of workers' lives. It was not expansion. It was vertical compression of human misery. We had simply moved the machinery of human consumption deeper into the planet's structure, creating new levels where the administratum could process more people into components more efficiently, because the extreme conditions accelerated the optimization process. I performed my maintenance inspections in these zones for approximately 7 months. Each day, I descended into the deep levels, assessed structural conditions, logged deterioration in support columns and ventilation systems, and observed the endless processing of human lives into component functions. And each day, I felt the fragment of my original consciousness that had survived the excavation work growing stronger. The survival anomaly at level 147 had disrupted my modification in ways I could not have predicted. Instead of completing the transformation into pure operational efficiency that Torvik embodied, I was experiencing something like a reversal. A reconstruction of the psychological frameworks that allowed me to evaluate my circumstances in terms of meaning and horror, rather than simply as operational conditions. I began to experience emotional responses again. Not with the intensity I had possessed before conscription, but with sufficient clarity to distinguish them as emotions rather than as irrelevant data noise. I felt horror when I observed children suffering from heat exposure. I felt anger when I calculated the casualty rate required to excavate each converted zone. I felt grief when I accessed memories of the workers who had died during my time in the excavation crews. I was becoming partially human again, and that created a problem that had no operational solution. I could not continue existing in the maintenance role while retaining human psychological architecture. The conditions I observed during inspections, the suffering, the waste, the systematic consumption of human lives by machinery that served no purpose beyond its own perpetuation, generated emotional responses that my consciousness could not efficiently process without experiencing significant distress. But I also could not terminate. The fragment of my consciousness that evaluated continued existence as preferable to termination remained active. I wanted to continue existing, even though continuation meant witnessing and participating in a system I now recognized as a machinery of institutionalized horror. This contradiction, the simultaneous desire to continue existing and the inability to exist without experiencing unmanageable psychological distress, created what I can only describe as a trapped condition. I was neither fully component nor fully human. I existed in an intermediate state where I retained sufficient consciousness to recognize what had been done to me and to all the other workers processed through the excavation system, but insufficient agency to alter those circumstances or remove myself from participation in them. I continue existing in that trapped condition. This testimony is being recorded during my 3,247th day of operation in the maintenance division. That is approximately 8.9 years. I am now 29 standard years old, which exceeds the average life expectancy for deep-level workers by approximately 6 years. I have survived not through complete conversion to component status, but through maintaining the intermediate condition, partially human enough to navigate complex inspection tasks that require evaluative judgment, but sufficiently modified to endure the psychological weight of what I observe without complete cognitive collapse. I descend into the deep excavation zones regularly. Each inspection cycle, I observe new sectors being completed and converted into habitation blocks. Each cycle, I observe more people being relocated to those blocks. Each cycle, I calculate the casualties required to excavate each new sector and the suffering that will be experienced by every person who occupies the converted spaces. The excavation continues. The Hive City's population continues expanding. The system perpetuates itself with perfect mechanical efficiency, consuming human lives and converting them into components that maintain the machinery's operation. And I continue as a witness to that process, trapped in a condition where I cannot die and cannot live in any manner that resembles the human existence I briefly experienced before my conscription. The drilling operations have now reached level 173. That is 17.3 kilometers below the original surface. The temperature in the active excavation zones exceeds 115 degrees. The geothermal vent breach rate has accelerated to the point where containment operations consume more resources than the excavation itself. Eventually, I have performed the calculations. The drilling will reach depths where sustained human operation is not physically possible regardless of equipment or modification. At that point, the excavation will presumably halt, not because the administratum will recognize the futility of continued expansion, but because the machinery will have consumed all available space that can support human existence at any level of suffering the system is willing to impose. But that point is not yet reached. The drilling continues. New workers are conscripted. New caverns are excavated. New habitation zones are completed and filled with populations that have no other space to occupy. The cycle perpetuates. I am providing this testimony because I need someone to understand what occurs in the deep excavation zones, what the expansion actually consists of, what becomes of the workers who are processed through the conscription system. We do not serve any genuine purpose. We do not pioneer new territories or expand the Imperium's glory. We simply dig deeper graves and call them homes, creating spaces where billions of humans can be stored in conditions that optimize the compression of human misery into the smallest possible volume. The system taught us to recite phrases about duty and protection, but those phrases were never true. They were conditioning mechanisms designed to make us compliant with our own consumption. The Emperor, the institutional construct the system invoked to justify its demands, does not protect. No protective presence intervenes to prevent our suffering or alter the conditions that systematically destroy us. We are alone with the machinery, and the machinery continues operating according to purely mechanical principles that serve no purpose beyond perpetuation. I understand this now. I understand it with the clarity that comes from observing the system's operation from a position inside its machinery for nearly 9 years. And I am trapped in that understanding, unable to terminate and unable to continue existing without experiencing it. My name was Davrin Cole. I was 19 standard years old when the administratum conscripted me for excavation service. I was optimized for operational efficiency in an environment designed to consume me. I survived that optimization through an anomaly that should not have occurred, and now I exist as a witness to the machinery's operation, documenting what I observe in the hope that someone will understand what the expansion costs and what it produces. The drilling continues downward, the population continues expanding, and I continue descending into the spaces we excavated, observing the endless processing of human lives into compressed components stored in caverns too hot for survival, but sufficient for continued existence. This is what overpopulation forces. This is what expansion becomes when the system has nowhere left to build except deeper into its own grave. I am still here, still descending, still witnessing. The depth increases. The horror remains constant, and the machinery never stops.